There's several phrases that get used when it comes to racing, and those phrases have often given us a sort of warped, if you want to call it that, image of what racing should truly be about. If in doubt, flat out, said Colin McRae. Rubbing is racing, say NASCAR fans, and if you no longer go for a gap is used by people who race online who have absolutely no clue what the background of that quote means. If in doubt, flat out was used by somebody who ended up upside down or embedded in a tree more often than not because he'd simply gone too fast. See the 1998 and 2001 WRC finales. And the phrase, if you no longer go for a gap, was used as a way of saying, yeah, I shunted him off the road, what are you going to do about it? Both of those phrases are taken out of context, but one way more than the other. Guess which one? But another belief that has cropped up in recent years is that cars don't push anymore. They're saving fuel, they're saving tyres, they're saving components. That's not racing. People believe you should be going all out all the time. 100% all the time. But there has been times in the past where the cars would be saved, particularly at Hockenheim when they did have limited fuel. They had to turn down the engines to make sure those engines made it to the end of the Grand Prix, or to make sure the fuel made it to the end of the Grand Prix. But back in that same time period, there was a man who was able to win 51 races by not driving as fast as possible. How? Well, that's what I'm here to teach you about. Now, you know how I'll do one video and then there'll be about 4 or 5 spin-offs of that particular video? I get the feeling this is going to have way more. Alain Prost, the professor, turned 70 today. So how was he able to win 4 World Championships and 51 Grand Prix, which was then a record at the time he retired, by driving in completely the opposite manner to his main rival? Prost started in Formula 1 in 1980. After winning the European Formula 3 series in 1979, he had been hanging out with Brabham and Ligier, but it was ultimately McLaren, then still under the ownership of Teddy Meyer, that signed him. While there, he'd be partnered with veteran Northern Irishman John Watson, and Prost would do something that only 2 other men would do between 1973 and 1993, and that is score a point in a debut race. The other 2 were Johnny Herbert and Jean Alesi. This point would be the first of 5 he'd score across that season. The McLaren of 1980 was not a particularly great car, and Prost would be 15th in the driver's standings, just 1 point behind Watson, who was no slouch. Watson won a race from the back of the grid after all. Yeah, alright, almost the back of the grid. The car was unreliable, and after just 1 season of a 2-season contract, Prost was upping sticks and moving to Renault. Not only was the car unreliable, he was also taking blame from the team for several accidents, and Meyer also wanted to sign American Kevin Kogan, which effectively would force Prost out. Leaving McLaren for Renault, citing reliability as a reason, seems hilarious in 2025. It probably wasn't seen as a good move in 1980 either, because Renault's turbos weren't exactly great. The thing about those turbos is that a Renault would often be found near or out the front of the grid, but in the races they blow up because the technology still wasn't there yet. I have done a video on how Renault was more successful as an engine supplier than a team and found that one pretty interesting. But it's true. Renault as a team scored a lot of poles, but winning wasn't something they did a lot of. But when you go through your first season in Formula 1, which is still at the time incredibly dangerous, and you get a concussion and a broken wrist, you're going to want to move elsewhere. Although you're moving to a Renault team where reliability isn't exactly their forte. But when you've got Alain Prost, who was famously very gentle on his cars, things might start to look up a little bit. I say that because the opening few rounds of 1981 weren't exactly fun. At Long Beach, he was involved in a collision with De Cesaris and was then involved in a collision with Pironi at Jacarapagua, but did finish on the podium in Argentina. He didn't finish the next 4 races, but won his first ever Grand Prix at Dijon, which was a great moment. You know, the Frenchman in the French car just won the French Grand Prix. See also when Olivier Panis won at Monaco in 1996. Okay, Monaco isn't France, but close enough. But things weren't so happy behind the scenes. His teammate René Arnoux wasn't particularly happy with the younger Frenchman, because Alain had just turned up and started battering him. And Prost was a young man who had entered a world that, at the time, had become stacked with talent. As Motorsport magazine pointed out, Prost had slotted right into a pointy end of the grid that contained Nelson Piquet, Gilles Villeneuve, Alan Jones, René Arnoux, Keke Rosberg, Didier Pironi, John Watson, and a returning Niki Lauda. To turn up and be rubbing noses with that lot, you've got to be able to wheel. But one thing that people in the know say is that Alain was probably the most complete of all of those drivers. All of them. Villeneuve and Pironi were quick, but Gilles was a lot like Colin McRae. Slowing down? What does that mean? Piquet was also quick but had a little bit of a temper. Lauda had been out for a bit but was still bloody good even with those 1976 injuries and so on. But still, that must have been one hell of a time to enter Formula 1. Of all the drivers I just mentioned, there's 8 world championships between them. More when you factor in Prost, and the tally should have been a bit higher. After winning his first Grand Prix at Dijon, Prost led the next 5 Grand Prix. He took his first pole position at Hockenheim, and every race his Renault wanted to finish, he was on the podium. By the end of 1981, he was just 7 points off eventual champion Piquet. Prost spent 1982 and 1983 with Renault, where over time the relationship between him and Arnoux deteriorated. It also got him on the wrong side of the French media, with Prost saying that the French don't like winners, they like martyrs that lose gloriously. He did continue to win races, such as the 1982 South African Grand Prix where he inherited the win after Rosberg and Piquet were disqualified for the water-cooled brakes fiasco. Then in 1983, Prost finished just 2 points behind Piquet after Brabham had a resurgence later on in the season. The Brabham at that time was running something called rocket fuel, which wasn't actually rocket fuel that came from a time where Germany was led by a, we'll call him an Austrian painter, but it was called rocket fuel because the car was simply so powerful with it because it combusted at a higher intensity or something. I've done the video on it. I can't remember what I actually said in that video, but either way, Renault was so close to a championship, but Brabham and Piquet just pipped them. Prost said that Renault had been too cautious in their approach to that season and that's why Brabham had just beaten them. Perhaps Renault thought they'd got it all sewn up and took their eye off the ball. Renault then used Prost as the scapegoat, saying that it was Alain to blame for losing the title and they fired him after French racing favourite Arnoux left the team. And Prost had said that the car was not competitive at the season finale in South Africa. On top of this, he had to run away to Switzerland because Renault team employees set fire to his car. 2 days after he was fired, he went back to McLaren, now in the hands of Sir Ronald of Dennis. The 1984 season has had its own video, so already we're at 3 spin-offs: water-cooled brakes, rocket fuel, and 1984. This is the famous half-point season where at the Monaco Grand Prix, make that 4 spin-offs, Prost won the race. But half points were awarded because the rain was too intense to race safely. Even back in those days they were concerned about racing safely in the rain. The irony being that if the race had gone full distance, Prost could have finished second and still won the title. But that was a strange day. Some to this day still claim that Senna, who was running second in a Toleman, was shafted of a race victory. In addition, you had Stefan Bellof running third in a Tyrrell, and he, Brundle and Tyrrell would be kicked out of the championship for the world's fastest shotgun fiasco. 5 spin-offs. Moreover, Prost had an engine misfire, Senna had damaged suspension, and with Bellof later being disqualified, it looked like that if the race had indeed gone the full distance, none of them would have scored points. 1984 was at the time the most dominant season in F1 history. McLaren won all but 4 Grand Prix that year. The ones they didn't win were at Zolder, won by Alboreto, Montreal and Detroit, won by Piquet, and then the Dallas Grand Prix, won by Rosberg. The tag-branded Porsche, coupled with the Barnard-designed McLaren that was then driven by Lauda and Prost, was a killer combination. And Prost won 7 of the Grand Prix that year, equalling Jim Clark's then record. But because of Monaco giving him 4.5 points instead of the 9 as would be for a win in this time period, he lost the championship. By a whisker. In 1985 though, France finally got its first F1 world champion. Prost won 5 of the 16 Grand Prix that year, with the 6th being a disqualification because he was 2 kilos underweight, but he still put on a demolition job. He was 20 points clear of Alboreto at the end, which at the time, because 9 points for a win, was 2, well more than 2, race victories clear. It was pretty dominant, all things considered. But 1996 wasn't so dominant for McLaren. Honda had teamed up with Williams and Piquet and Mansell were kicking 7 colours out of each other. The most famous of these being the race at Brands Hatch, where Mansell had to take the spare car that was set up for Nelson, but then dominated the Grand Prix. That's 6 spin-offs, although that one needs a remake. Because of Mansell and Piquet constantly taking points off each other, Prost was still in the hunt, and 1986 is considered a lucky championship because with it all still on the line, Mansell's tyre colossally blew at Adelaide, and Prost, who was ahead of him on the road at that time, took the championship in one of the most dramatic ways ever seen in F1 history. And that's a video I do need to do in the future. Fun statistic time, 1985-1986 was the first time somebody had won back-to-back world championships since 1959-1960, which is when Jack Brabham last did the double. The most recent times that somebody has won just the one world championship were 1996, 1997, 2007, 2009 and 2016. We expect back-to-back World Championships these days. As for the whole fuel saving thing, twice during 1986 Prost had to coast to the line with very little, if any, fuel in the tank. At Imola, he managed to coast over the line and won the race. And at Hockenheim, where else, he ran out of fuel on the start-finish straight and tried to push it over the line, but to no avail. He was 4th when the car stopped, but classified 6th in the end. In 1987, Prost ended up becoming the most successful Formula 1 driver in history when he beat Jackie Stewart's 14-year-old record of 28 Grand Prix victories. Jackie was immensely happy to see Alain better his record, calling Alain the best driver of his generation, and this is coming from Sir Jackie, a man who definitely has wheel knowledge. The thing is, by the time 1987 rolled around, the tag engines in those McLarens were obsolete versus the other engines, and the turbos themselves were a dying breed in Formula 1. Some teams would ditch them for naturally aspirated in 1988, with them being outlawed fully in 1989. But Prost wasn't going to be kept down. Despite the Williams Hondas being more powerful and faster with naturally faster drivers, Alain still won the Brazilian Grand Prix after qualifying 3 seconds down on Mansell's time. He developed a race setup that meant he'd be faster on the straights but slower in the corners, and through saving his tyres in the corners, he was able to get past everybody else, and won on a 2-stop strategy compared to everybody else that had to do 3. He won that race by 40 seconds over local hero Nelson Piquet, and it's at this race he pretty much solidified that whole thing of being the professor, simply playing a longer game rather than being the fastest man out there, and thinking smarter rather than being faster. At the end of the season, he was 4th overall, 30 points behind Piquet, and it was one of the occasions where he was the furthest behind the leaders. Only on 3 occasions was he more than 1.5 race wins from the guy that won the championship. Now we move into 1988. The MP44, the arrival of Senna, the beginning of the Senna and Prost rivalry, and the beginnings of French bias. For the sake of not making this video 97 hours long, I'm not going to go into every conceivable detail because these subjects have already been done before or they need redoing, and it's better to focus entirely on one thing individually than try and cram it all in here and get 997 comments telling me I forgot something. Or, because Senna is involved, I'll get hundreds of comments telling me that I deliberately didn't say something because that makes Senna look bad. But, as it was, the 1988 season was the most dominant season on record since that 1985 season that Prost won. And because only the best 11 of the 16 races counted, it was a rare occasion where the driver with the most points didn't win the championship. Another time this happened is when Graham Hill lost the championship in 61? 64? It might have been 64. Senna won more races, but Prost scored more points. And because of the best 11 of 16 rule, Senna, who had scored 11 fewer points than Prost, won, because the rule favoured wins over consistency, a rule that would be ditched for the 1991 season. Prost had also been the one that recommended that Senna join him at McLaren. Honda wanted a Brazilian driver for the South American market, and Senna was a younger choice compared to Piquet. But despite Senna almost shunting Prost into a wall at Estoril, they raced very cleanly, and were both treated as equals. About that, Prost started to have suspicions that Senna was getting better engines, better gearboxes and just overall better equipment than he was, but he had some assurances from Honda. He was told, yes, the mechanics are more excited to work with Senna than they are with you, but you are getting equal equipment. But Prost was still a little bit unsure about that. 1989 though, things turned sour. At the San Marino Grand Prix, a gentleman's agreement was in place about not overtaking on the first lap, but the first start was aborted, so Senna took that as, well, this agreement's no longer in place. Senna took the lead on the restart and didn't look back, and it was the beginning of the Senna-Prost rivalry becoming what it was. Prost accused Senna of dangerous driving and then accused Honda of giving Senna better gear than he was getting, forcing him to say that he would leave McLaren if this continued. Dennis, meanwhile, had to find a way of making sure that he didn't, such as allocating engines randomly to ensure parity. Prost told Motorsport magazine that he'd mostly raced against friends. He went on holiday with Piquet in 1983 despite them fighting for the championship, and had good relationships with Rosberg, Lauda, Cheever, Watson and so on. The relationship with Senna was different, and it might make you think that maybe you have to think differently to achieve the goals you want to achieve. Prost said in that same interview he preferred to be relaxed and happy. What was going on at McLaren at that time was not making him happy or relaxed, which is probably why he gets labelled as a political driver. A lot of people, particularly Senna fans, label Prost as this sort of Machiavellian scheming little shit that tried to get everything done off track to suit him rather than simply beating people on the track like a real driver would. But the thing is, everybody who's ever worked with Alain has said that he had a very high work ethic and was very, very, very professional and a very good team player. Alain, meanwhile, blames Nigel Mansell for starting that whole thing. He also said, "I don't know why. If you look at the Senna film, you have Balestri in the middle of everything, and he was French. The story in Japan is ridiculous. It was Ayrton's decision the year before to start on the right. People never tell the full story, even some media. There are two things. This story and Nigel very often saying I was political. You know why? Because I was speaking Italian at Ferrari. We never spoke Italian in the briefing, it was always in English, so I never understood. There is a sort of frustration. I was trying to do the best job, like everybody, trying to get the best things that are good for me. I never asked anybody to set up my car, that is for sure. I never hid anything about my car, and the other drivers couldn't drive my setup anyway. I always did my job. Political? I don't accept that." Prost won the 1989 title in very, 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 very controversial circumstances, by which point he'd signed a deal with Ferrari to go to Maranello for 1990. Then at the following year's Japanese Grand Prix, Senna repaid him. With interest. Prost stayed with Ferrari through 1991, and much like things had done at Renault, the relationship soured. He was later sacked from the team for saying the car drove like a truck, or words to that effect, and was on sabbatical for 1992. But in his back pocket, he'd once again played the long game. He'd got a contract for 1993 with Williams that forced Mansell out of the team at the end of 1992. And Prost would have a nice new FW15C with all the bells and whistles on it, along with a new teammate in Damon Hill. It took a while for him to get used to the car, with his super smooth driving style not really compatible with the way those cars needed to be driven. Senna, in that same car, or Schumacher in that same car, might have had a 1988 style season with it. But Prost managed to get his fourth and final title secured with a race to spare come the end, and retired at the end of the 1993 season with the most wins in Formula 1 history. A record that stood until Schumacher broke it in 2001, and a tally that was doubled by Hamilton in 2021, which shows how the goalposts get moved and how many more races are on the calendar. Prost's retirement came because Senna was inbound for 1994. While there had been a strict no Senna clause in his 1993 contract, there wasn't such clause for 1994, and Patrick Head actually wanted to keep Prost. But Alain, having endured 1988 and 1989, didn't want the stress of all that again. And Alain had also used the words to the effect of, "I'm not willing to risk my life against somebody who's not afraid to die." This being because, during a meeting with Patrick, Senna had called up saying, "You need a reason to sign me? God is behind me." After retiring from Formula 1, Prost went into management after a brief stint as a TV pundit. He actually regrets buying out the Ligier team and renaming it Prost, which lasted between 1997 and 2001. But at the end of it all, he still has a Formula 1 career that gets, well, often overshadowed. There are people out there that suggest that Prost should be a 6-time world champion, at least. Under the 1991 rules for points, he is a champion in 1988, and if Senna gets the Schumacher treatment for 1990, then he wins thanks to an exclusion. But it is what it is. 51 wins in that era of racing is still an incredible statistic. It almost doubles the previous record that was set by Stewart, and it's more wins than Senna, who is repeatedly called the fastest and greatest driver of all time. Senna sits on 41, Prost 51. The fact that Prost was able to achieve everything he was able to achieve without being the fastest speaks quite a bit as to how you can win by racing smarter rather than faster. Why push for second when third is the most you're going to realistically get? And so on. But I guess the reason he gets slept on like he does is because of the whole Senna thing. Because of Balestri, because of French bias, because of Suzuka 89, because of the Dirty Cypher poll, because of the Senna film, because of social media, because of, well, Senna's overall legend. Motorsport magazine said that if you get asked Prost or Senna, very few are going to say both. Same way if you ask Metallica or Megadeth, very few people say both. But as one person said in a comment section, without Prost, Senna might not have been half the legend that he is. 4 World Championships, 51 wins, and 5 World Championship teammates at some point during his career. Some of them won after Prost and some of them won during Prost, but either way, 5 World Championship teammates, and at a time where there were so many legendary names in the sport. The guy is a legend. So then, a look at the career of Alain Prost on his 70th birthday. If this has been an interesting video for you, then do like the video so I know a good job was done. And for more stuff from the channel, get subscribed and also get that bell on so you never miss out on anything else that I do around here. Massive thanks as ever go out to the fine bunch of lads over on Patreon that continue to support me at a more personal level. And if you want to help keep the lights on around here, there's a link to Patreon down in the description, as well as a link to Discord, socials and other bits and bobs you might want or need to know. Well, there's super thanks if you want to top up this massive coffee cup, and memberships if you want to do Patreon without the Patreon. So until next time, I've been Millward, have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.